welcome Shalini Vajjhala today, who is the founder and CEO of Refocus Partners, joining us from San Diego. And she's going to speak about her experience and a new program, a new set of offerings that they're actually launching. So we're kind of an early audience for this. Very exciting. Welcome, Shalini. And I will stop sharing and hand you over the screen.
Wonderful. Thanks, Justine, and thanks to everyone for joining today. Good morning from San Diego. I rarely disclose our location in the depths of winter, so it's a delight to see you all. I'm thrilled to be able to start this year with this conversation because I think we have such an interesting few years ahead of us. And I'm wildly optimistic about the adaptation field. So I hope this talk conveys some of that optimism, but also some of the really pragmatic ways to work through the molasses that sometimes surrounds adaptation projects. So I'm going to share with you today some things that our team at Refocus does. And it's really drawn on our experience working in and with all levels of government over the last 10 years, because so much of this work is really connected to public funding, public priorities, and public action. So I'm going to dive right in and really hit that note of optimism, which is we, in the last year, have seen a huge shift in federal investment in infrastructure with an emphasis on climate change. So this is a graph from the Brookings Institution about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, EJA, not one of the greatest acronyms to ever come out of the federal government here in the US, but this is the most money since Roosevelt for physical infrastructure investment. It's the most we will likely see in our professional lifetimes. And we have a 3 to 5 year window to really change the course of 20 to 50 years worth of what communities build and what they look like and how well they work and who they serve. The thing I want you all to pay attention to is if you look on the far right of this graph, you'll see a little red bar for resiliency. You'll see one next to it for water. But these are actually the smaller colors of money that are available. And the opportunity for all of us in the field of adaptation and working with different types of infrastructure is really to take all of these other colors of money and make them work for climate smart investment. So that's really what I'm going to talk through with you today. How does that look on the ground? Well, it looks a lot like this, right? Communities have needs and priorities that are really all over the place. You can be talking to a local government official who goes from a meeting on sea level rise to school lunches. Each one is important. Each one has a different level of urgency, and they're rarely organized in ways that communities can understand how these decisions are being made. The way that local governments function is in these silos. Everybody is, I think from their own vantage points, deeply familiar with different silos and the effort it takes to walk out of one and into another. But taking those community needs and budgets, matching them up to public sector silos, and then translating that to the layer cake that folks in the finance industry like to see when it comes to project finance is really an exercise in English to English translation, right? So part of what our team does at Refocus is we come at this by hammering home a few key things and anchoring to a few very simple questions to get projects motivated and rolling. So one of the first things that we always try to impress upon local government partners especially is that when we do our work well, success is often something that doesn't happen. So prior to starting Refocus, I spent a few years at the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is a common problem in environment and conservation, in fields where you are essentially investing in prevention, where you're preserving a brighter future. The first year that is often applauded, right? There's a disaster in recent memory. Everybody is aware of what hasn't happened. The second year, clearly you don't need your budget, so it's cut. And the third year, your staff and your program go away. Making the case for long-term adaptation projects means taking that definition of success and creating a durable version of it so that folks understand the road not taken, understand the value of investing. And this has been challenging in every field. If you think about the difference between preventative health and public health versus, the firefighting that comes when we have, for example, a global pandemic, this is just flat out hard. And it takes a lot of upfront coordination and messaging. So how can you break through this? Well, our team really focuses on a very simple concept, which is when we talk about funding, oftentimes we are talking about widening the imagination. Keep in mind that full strip of all the different colors of money that can be applied for climate projects. Widening the imagination means taking someone out of what they're familiar with and kind of tiptoeing them gently into spaces where they might be less familiar, but have huge opportunities. So we have 4 key ways that we do this for our projects at Refocus. I'm going to walk through the 4 ways and then give you examples of different types of projects that we've done over the last decade. The first thing we do is we really look for who's motivated to act. There are a lot of describers in this field where they will impress upon you the nature of the problem. It takes a different approach to find out who is actually willing to act. And one of the questions that we use most often to find those people, actual people, is who's losing money today if we don't do this project? It's a deceptively simple question, but it reveals completely different actors than you might see otherwise. So I'll share examples of where, it's a hospital system that's flooded, but it's the city that has the option to invest in protection. So this is really about revealing where the momentum is for getting projects done. The second thing we do is we really try to sandwich together things that make money with things that create value. Where can parking fees help pay for flood protection? Where can investing in better road maintenance or green stormwater infrastructure reduce road maintenance costs, right? So think about things at the seams of sectors. And that's the third thing, is find those sectoral seams and think not just about benefits, but beneficiaries. This is something that the environmental field has long suffered from, which is you will often see things about the hundreds of billions of dollars of benefits for something. But if they don't get down to who benefits, that general sense of urgency and opportunity doesn't translate to someone who will actually act. So we are very clear when we look at cross-sector projects about not just characterizing the benefits and generally sharing those, but about finding the beneficiaries of good work. And then the last thing we do is we really look for ways to link physical and financial protection. So I'm going to walk through some examples of projects that we've actually done over the last 10 years with these questions at the core of how we have initiated the work and broken through that messy space of infrastructure pre-development. Pre-development is, if those of you who are listening have ever responded to requests for proposals or RFPs, it's everything that goes in before you know what you actually want, right? That's the space for widening the imagination. So I'm going to start with an example on finding motivated champions. These are examples from across the world of the last several years where extreme heat has disrupted transit and shipping and logistics worldwide. In the simplest terms, when it gets really hot out for a really long time, materials fail, tracks bend and buckle. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that when it is hot out for a long time, a lot of transit authorities, what they do is they run fewer trains and they run them more slowly. I want you to think about the consequences of this, right? So in theory, a transit system should be a champion for transit. And now it is cutting its core service to avoid risk. In this case, we really learned how to pair the question of who loses money today, the transit authority, with an incredibly important equity reframing, which is who suffers when you don't get this right. So think about the answers to those two questions. Who loses money? The transit authority is hemorrhaging money. They are losing revenues by running fewer trains and running them more slowly. People aren't on them and they aren't paying. It's a very clear answer to that question. Who suffers? That's the transit dependent worker. It's the older person who is now sitting outside longer on the hottest days of the year, waiting for a service that's not coming. If you answer each of those questions separately, the transit authority is doing something very practical, which is reducing their risk and reducing their long-term costs, right? A derailment costs a lot more than a loss of revenue in the short term. If you look at who suffers, you might solve the problem by saying, oh, we'll design better, more shaded train and transit stops, train and bus stops. This is the kind of thing that our team has a very healthy sense of rage about, where a better bus stop is not the solution to this problem. The solution to this problem is looking at those losses of money to reduce the suffering. And I love this example because it actually isn't something that we have designed huge systems over. Oftentimes, we've had advisory conversations, and it's completely changed the prioritization of projects in a capital plan to lift up those heat resilience projects and make sure they go first, because we can make them look like energy efficiency. You can save money and have them pay for themselves. So this is the kind of thing we do, is we start with conversation. Sometimes that leads to project design. Sometimes it leads to a change in priorities or a change in how something is financed through savings, through other colors of money. But I wanted to lead with that example because pairing who suffers and who loses money reveals an entirely different approach than you would get with either question alone. So I'm going to jump to a project that was one of our very first out of Refocus. We launched right after Hurricane Sandy hit the eastern seaboard, so New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. And we started with seed funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and created a competition for 8 cities. We selected 8 cities. And our hypothesis that we were testing was that designers alone couldn't come up necessarily with all of the pieces required to design and finance $100 million scale resilience projects. So this was very early days for resilience, if you all think back to 2013, 2012. One of the winning cities in the competition we designed, the Reinvest competition, was the city of Hoboken, which was, many of you I suspect will be familiar. Hoboken is like a tiny postage stamp of a city. It's a square mile, almost fully paved and built like a bowl. So it held at parts about 12 feet of standing water after Superstorm Sandy. Many older people were trapped in their apartments on higher stories of buildings for 2 weeks without power. That's who suffers, right? Who loses money? Well, it turned out the hospital system in Hoboken was actually pretty well fortified against the storm, but the water system below the hospital was not. And so the hospital flooded because of back pressure through the water system that flooded the hospital. This is where you really see where you can't be an island, right? When it comes to resilience. There are points of failure outside of your control that require collaboration. So we worked with the city of Hoboken, and this is where we really looked at how do we align things that pay for themselves with things that might not naturally pay for themselves. The city, after talking with us to initiate this project, looked at us like we were crazy. They were, we asked them, what do you need? And they pointed to the water outside and said, well, we need pumps for flooding. But yes, but what else do you need? And it took 3 or 4 tries. And the leadership there is extraordinary, right? They were able to zoom out in a moment of crisis and say, well, we really need green space. We need more parking so that cars aren't floating down our streets in uncontrolled ways in the next storm. And we need flood protection. That we could work with. So the city identified this really troubling site that they had been wrangling with for a long time behind chain link. It was 6 acres of contaminated land. And we worked with them in the conceptual design to basically help them design a bathtub with a combination of green infrastructure and a parking facility that in the original version of this, we actually said, well, why don't you dig down to bedrock and build it like a bathtub so you can flood it from the bottom up. It saves you from having to build a pump or a new water treatment plant. If the water's going to be there anyway, might as well hold it. And that design evolved over time to this project, the Northwest Resiliency Park, that's almost near complete construction. We ran the first leg of a relay race with the city. We helped them secure funding for land acquisition, for cleanup of the contaminated soils, and then set them running so that they were able to secure $90 million to do this project over the course of 6 years. It's an extraordinary achievement that Hoboken deserves the majority of the credit for. We just helped design the start and finish line for a relay race and ran alongside them for that first leg. But it produced something that's really important for pre-development in that widening of the imagination. We were able, with the city, to walk from the idea of what they could afford, which is a pump for flooding, to what they needed, which is a park. And I think this is one of the projects that is now being held up by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, as an example of what resilience can look like in practice. Adaptation can and should be gorgeous. It should be multifunctional, and it should be ambitious. So we did that by aligning these different colors of money. This is flood protection paid for in part by parking fees. So again, you'll hear a theme through everything I'm saying, which is bring these themes together. And it characterizes a lot of what we do. That same competition, the Reinvest Initiative, we work with the city of Milwaukee. The top is a conceptual drawing we did for a 3-acre site in Milwaukee to help them address something that they were dealing with green stormwater infrastructure and flooding and environmental justice communities. And there was this really bizarrely shaped 3-acre site that we worked with them to lay out a concept, really, for a technology demonstration area and a training area, because they were finding things that, in practice were really quite different than the theory, where they had to think about, if you do porous pavement to better manage stormwater, what do you do when you have salt and sand truck drivers that come and just fill in all those pores? So there was really a need to test different materials, to think about how things work in practice. And Milwaukee was one of the early leaders in green stormwater infrastructure. We left Milwaukee with the race course design. We didn't run really anywhere with them. And 6 years later, of their own momentum, they have built what's called the Green Tech Station on the site, which includes, on the left, a whole bunch of green stormwater infrastructure for reducing flood risk, but also these really cool testing stations for everything from rain barrels to permeable pavement. We took these ideas from Milwaukee to another Reinvest city, El Paso, and worked with them on something that we never expected starting out. El Paso is such an interesting city. And it turned out their biggest barrier to resilience projects was their maintenance department. It was a bunch of folks who didn't understand why they needed to do extra work for all this beautification. And so we had to flip the problem around. We looked at the cross-sector value and we said, well, are you guys aware that your roads aren't lasting as long as you think they are? And the maintenance guys got it immediately. We were able to talk to them and say, well, hey, if you keep water off your roads, if you reduce flash flooding through green infrastructure, you're not sending your teams out there in hazardous conditions, and your roads are going to last longer. So all of a sudden, you had a financial case similar to that transit authority inside the city, where you could bring departments together that wouldn't have worked together before by making something easier for a department. So this is really where you need to look across a sector and say, how do I make your job easier? How do I reduce your costs? How do I reduce your risks? How do I increase the value of the service that you're providing? And very oftentimes that'll reveal a design solution that may not be available otherwise. Last example of those four that I gave of, I'll repeat them, finding those champions, right? Or making the champions known to themselves, aligning things across sectors. And really, this last one is the biggest of the set of projects that we have at Refocus, where we have been for the last 5 years or so, really working at the edge of design and insurance to understand how does physical protection create financial value and for whom? So if you think about a community that's better protected from coastal storm surge and hurricane risk, well, who benefits from that? Oftentimes it's industry, right? The public sector is the smallest asset holder, even though they're doing these huge projects. Over the last few years, we've been playing a light, similar to the transit authorities, light advisory role with a group of drainage districts in coastal Texas that is working on a project called colloquially, it's a Army Call project that goes by the Ike Dike. This is a massive $30+ billion program, and it's very complicated. It's very controversial. The status quo is also not okay. So there's an awareness there has to be something done. There are a lot of different groups down there working on it, and our team has been trying to thread the needle by asking this question again. Let's go back to who loses money and who suffers. Well, who suffers when there's no protection? We don't have to look very far. You go back to Hurricane Harvey, and it's the communities of workers in coastal industries that are now dealing with chemical releases and explosions because folks can't get to facilities in a storm. We need to be really thoughtful about how we make regional transition to greater resilience. These projects don't happen overnight. The Tiny Hoboken project is 6 years in. The Ike Dike will be a 10 to 15 year project. New York Harbor, same thing, right? San Francisco Bay. So thinking about the time in between, a lot of what we're doing right now with federal money is really trying to make visible in that relay race, who are the applicants for public funds? Who are the beneficiaries, not just the benefits? Who are the champions for better solutions? And what needs to happen through these transitions? So as we have been working through this, our team at Refocus has realized that a lot of our work in this pre-development space has really taken shape as something that's more broadly relevant. And so I'm going to preview for you something that we have been cooking up as an initiative in Refocus that we're planning to spin out as an independent nonprofit in the coming months. And it's called the Pre-Collective. It's taking all those building blocks of pre-development and figuring out how do we build regional strength across the entire country so that as we think about a green transition and all the infrastructure required for a climate smart future, that's doing things like building new capacity around lithium. That's extraction. It's not pretty, it's industrial. And we have to confront the reality that a lot of what we're talking about for electrifying everything is coming from places where we have marginalized and pushed communities like tribal nations. We are working now to think about how do you bring together things like designing adaptation solutions with building community wealth, with creating durable governance structures so that we don't repeat mistakes of the past and that we don't invest in temporary infrastructure and leave communities behind. I think for all the challenges that we have ahead of us, we have so many more opportunities. I could not be more excited about the next few years. And I'm really so pleased that this learning exchange exists. So thank you to Justine and the team at CALE for the opportunity to present to you all today. We're going to be swinging away at all of these problems. Our whole focus at Refocus is collaboration. We're a small team that works with a lot of different partners to be able to get big projects done. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and to having a discussion with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. This is amazing. I learned so much, and I'm really excited for the questions that everyone has. And I think one question I have, maybe to start us off, Shalini, is I think the power of language is so evident in the way you're asking these questions, the way you're talking to municipal partners. Would you be willing to share a little bit about how you came to this approach?
Yeah. I like this question, Justine. It's not one I get asked often, but when I was in government, someone asked me where my training was in facilitation and diplomacy, and I had to kind of tip my head. And I have a large and complicated family. And, when I was young, I found myself having to translate for my grandmother what I was interested in working on in a language that I don't speak technically, right? So I'm fluent, but I don't have any technical vocabulary in it. And so I would be explaining things to her about design projects and having to take it and say, well, do you remember your coal stove? Like, picture capturing the smoke from that. I was like, okay, well, where would you put it? If you put it in a bucket, you put it underground. And so she's like, well, that would end up in the well. And that kind of thing, that could have been a technical conversation about, carbon capture, direct air carbon capture. But she understood right away what the implications were if you made the language simple enough and relevant enough. And so I think it's just a matter of being respectful to not underestimate anyone and meet people where they are. And that's why so much of our work is framed around these really simple questions. We intentionally avoid jargon everywhere possible. I will still occasionally slip into it, so our whole team has permission to interrupt one another and clarify. But I think it can be scary to simplify to that level because it feels like you're missing something, when in fact the opposite is true. The simpler you get, you often reveal these big structural cracks that can be paved over with more jargony explanations. So I'm really asking a question like, who's left out, rather than how do we characterize equity? You'll get a lot better answers to the first question rather than the second. So yeah, it is very intentional, Justine, and it's something we've refined over time. And we've also I've put my foot in my mouth many times, so it's helped acknowledge and move forward with mistakes.
That's great. And I guess maybe a related question. I mean, I think, who is losing money and who suffers immediately makes us think not only about the priorities of a government, but also community priorities, or what, someone's daily life might be in relation to infrastructure, to municipal services. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, these conversations often happen between you and municipal partners. Like, are there ways to get community members involved earlier in the process, or maybe a different way of thinking about it? Say I'm a community member who lives somewhere and I see a problem that I want to address. How do you start that conversation? How do you begin to make it public?
I think there are a couple different entry points for that conversation. And this connects to Rachel's question in the chat, so I'll try to do them at the same time. We try to have conversations and listen really early. And one of the ways that we manage expectations is by leading with learning, which is what I really love about this community, right? This notion of learning as the entry point to solution finding rather than presenting and getting feedback. So some of my very earliest work, even before I went into government, was around community mapping. So I'll give an international example of how you can do this. With community mapping, if you think about everybody who says, not in my backyard, well, what if you flip that around? What if you said, well, what is in your backyard? What's working? What's not? How close could something be before you got uncomfortable? and and those are very simple questions. So I had done a whole bunch of early community mapping work around different types of infrastructure and was invited by the World Bank to go with a team to rural southern Africa, so the country of Lesotho, where they were looking at building roads. And one of the things that folks had seen was that, the health sector had funded a whole bunch of really fancy clinics for dealing with the AIDS epidemic in Lesotho. And for folks who haven't spent time there, this is a tiny little mountain kingdom entirely inside of South Africa. So it's one of the few places where it snows in southern Africa. And I had spent zero time there. I had colleagues who are anthropologists at the World Bank, and they said, well, why don't we try using this community mapping technique to really engage people early to figure out who are the supposed beneficiaries of this infrastructure, but they're not using it. And so we went and we spent 6 weeks, and I learned that I should never, ever again spend 6 weeks on horseback. But we asked a set of really simple questions, Justine, which is, start with where you are now. And we got groups to draw these maps. And after a few of them, we realized, well, maybe we're going to split up the women and the men because these maps look really different. And we found that women weren't going to the health clinics because they were being attacked on the roads. The roads weren't safe. But it took 20 questions to get to that understanding. And we finally found it by saying, well, what are these gaps on your maps? And they're like, well, we don't go there. And when we overlaid them with the national GIS for the roads and the health clinics, guess where the holes were? They were right on top of the health clinics. What we realized was that these women weren't going to these clinics because that's where all the shepherd boys were, the teenage shepherd boys. And they were legitimately afraid of being assaulted. So they wouldn't go there. They would walk these elaborate ways and long distances. And so the recommendation we gave the transportation department was, in addition to building all these roads that you're going to build, is you have to include a set of footbridges that are less wide than a standard sheep. And that was our design spec. And that was where the beneficiaries of something really came to the forefront and completely changed what happened. And this was the rarest project where about 8 years afterward, we actually got feedback and an evaluation that turned out that health outcomes in these areas had improved, like measurably, for all of these communities that we had been in. And so that's where we could actually see that direct path to starting with the intended beneficiaries, asking simple questions, thinking about what they needed for safety and wealth building. And now they have a set of governance structures in that area where the power has shifted, where the women decide where the safe passage is, which has just been extraordinary. That's been a lesson I've carried all the way to thinking about large power lines and coastal protection.
Oh, it's an amazing story. Amazing example. So the question was, Shalini, how does your company seek to expand or stretch the limits of, or be creative within parameters of RFPs, going beyond what clients think are the limits of their own concepts and funding? And how do you carve out funding from larger projects that are very fixed in their goals and funding guidelines? So a lot to take on, but any part of that.
Oh, Josh, I love this question. I feel like this captures almost all of how I spend my days, which is, I was just doing this recently with folks in the middle of the country who are trying to figure out how to increase funding for green stormwater infrastructure. And one of the things that we were really looking at is, where do different ways of managing stormwater actually improve pedestrian safety? So it's entirely within the RFP and the scope of what they're doing, but how do you make a street tree actually slow down traffic and do that measurably? Well, in a lot of ways, it doesn't require you to change the design necessarily. It might if you want to get improved outcomes, but what it requires you to do is look at that thing differently and say, oh, okay, this is changing not just water flows, but traffic flows. or reducing speed or creating a buffer in front of a school. And so we do a lot of this where we will just take a thing and turn it on its side for someone who's used to looking at it a certain way. And a lot of this comes from design thinking. So my training is as an architect and an engineer, but going back to that, try to come up with 5 answers to the same question is a very simple entry point. And oftentimes we'll just challenge our partners and our clients by saying, okay, add a thing. If you could you put, empty cabling in here or empty conduit in here to run broadband? Who would use that? Would it work? Would you reach people? So very often we're either trying to add, subtract, or walk around something traditional to just look at it from a different angle. But carving out funding from larger projects, most of the time we're not carving out. We're adding things and getting more value for less money or the same amount of money. And so we try to really avoid creating territories and carving up a pie, because that leads to friction in relationships that affect project implementation down the road. What you want to do is, rather than create carve-outs, create strategic add-ons. So then you have your transportation ally who's like, hey, you got any trees for me? The next time they're planning.
Thank you. Great answer.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'm not seeing any more questions, so I will take the opportunity, but I want to remind people, feel free to drop them in the chat. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about an example, if there is one, of a project that didn't seem like it was ripe for this kind of thinking initially, but then you realized it was, or there was a way to come at it.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think the more practiced we've gotten at this, the easier it has become to see the entry points to it. And some of them are narrower than others, for sure, right? It's really dependent on the people involved. But I think many of the projects that I presented, at different points, we thought they had failed, right? And it was just a lack of patience or the wrong expectation for the amount of time something takes. So I'm not sure I have a good answer for you on this one, Justine, because I think we haven't found anywhere where the approach of the really simple questions hasn't worked, but we found a lot of places where it's yielded something completely different than what we started out expecting. So even that Hoboken project, right, which was pretty close to the original vision, it doesn't have an underground parking garage. They switched things around, they created cisterns and retention, but it turned out that the soil contamination in the site structure didn't allow for that original bathtub. It just wasn't cost effective. So I think we really try to stay flexible. It is the reason that our firm, we aren't real estate developers, right? We aren't attached to the end outcome that prevents that flexibility. And so that's why that relay race metaphor, I think, really holds for everything we do. But I'll think more about this one, because I do think failure is constant along the path to success. And so, but I don't think we've seen the approach fail as long as it's executed in ways that are respectful of all the folks we're talking to.
Yeah, that's great. I think let's keep following up on this. But maybe a related question, and then I'd love to go to Rachel's question in the chat. Maybe could you describe a little bit how much time some of these projects take? I think you've talked about the process, but I think that's probably key for folks who are thinking about how does this apply to their work.
Yeah, so our projects, I'll calibrate you to different scales, right? Both Hoboken and Milwaukee were in the 6 to 7 year time frame to construction, from initial conception and organizing the stakeholders to construction. Hoboken in particular is such a good example because they have done such extraordinary work with FEMA. They've got a number of other projects in the region coming out of the Rebuild by Design competition, which is now 10 years old. And they they were really entrepreneurial about finding additional funds throughout the whole process. Like they never stopped looking for more money to make it better. And what was interesting for them is that some of the last money in the door was FEMA money. But if you look at how the project is presented from the perspective of the federal government, it looks like that was the first money in. So it kind of ignores the 6 years of pre-development it took to get that $10 million from the federal government. And that's one of the things I try to say early and often to folks who are looking, for example, at the FEMA BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. That is extraordinary money. It's transformational. It is also just a pain to get organized for. And you need money to get money. You actually have to do a lot of this upfront work to be eligible for the federal funds. So the way that I think about this is really in terms of laying the breadcrumbs and applying for successively larger sources of funds. And one of the ones I'm most excited about right now that is kind of mysterious in federal language. So Rachel, this goes to your question in the chat, is the Department of Transportation has a giant program called PROTECT. And the word resilience is in the acronym, right? So it's like something like promoting resilient transportation operations and, It's a phenomenal program. It's $7.5 billion in formula funds. So formula funds are basically more water through existing fire hoses, is how you have to think about them. It's allocations to states and local governments. So if you aren't careful about where that fire hose is pointed, it's all going to go to the same types of things it always has. But there's a huge opportunity because within that program, there's a dedicated set aside at the state level where 2% of the money, so 2% every year of the total $7.5 billion has to be used for resilience planning. And that is going to be a challenge for people who don't do resilience planning, they do transportation planning, right? So it's going to take everybody else getting really friendly with your state transportation officials to get them to understand things like life cycle costs and maintenance and where roads are part of a water system. But again, it's a huge opportunity.
Thank you. Do you want to try to tackle any of these other questions before we close in about 4 minutes? We could talk about recommendations for convincing private stakeholders. How to green property.
Julia, this is like the $64 trillion question here in terms of small scale action that adds up to huge impact. I find that one of the most compelling things from homeowners is other homeowners nearby. And we've seen this with everything from solar to efficiency. It's just someone who can really give you the nuts and bolts about the process and the time involved. Because there's so much uncertainty and there's so much time. And I think we tend to focus on the cost, not the information and time hurdles. One of the things our team did early on is we realized local governments were facing this problem with finding and securing, sourcing and procuring innovative technologies, everything from streetlights to road materials, or, how do you put a drone in the water system to reduce leaks? And so one of our projects spun out as its own independent company called the Atlas, which was just acquired in December of 2020. And that is a similar type of resource for local governments to figure out from other local governments what's working, what's not, how do I do it, what were the pain points. And so I think that same thing applies for private homeowners, is buddying them up with someone who got through the hassle.
Thanks. I think there could be a whole other conversation about how you facilitate those conversations or partnerships.
Yeah.
So I think we're just about out of time. I see there's one more question about rewriting boundaries. We can try to sneak that in. Identifying at-risk communities and how some communities also suffer but fall outside of official jurisdiction.
This is one really close to my heart. So my former life at EPA was in international and tribal affairs. And really looking at, Indian country versus designated tribal lands, what's in, what's out, how do you serve folks who are the furthest left behind. I think this is going to be a massive challenge with all of the federal money out there because everybody is looking at eligibility. And what our team is doing to flip this around is we are leading with need. We're really trying to figure out what colors of money match the needs, not what colors of money are available. And I think when you start doing that, the administrative boundaries feel a little less like straitjackets, and you can find other resources if the standard ones don't work. But the short answer to a really important question.